And now we enter into the book of Judges, the goriest book of the Bible, the most brutal book of the Bible. I mean, the book of Joshua has a lot of like slaughter of cities and that kind of thing. But Judges gets pretty up close and personal with some individual gory deaths. I actually picked up a book at the youth gathering called Gory Deaths of the Bible. Don't judge me, but it looked interesting. Um, and yeah, half of them are from Judges. I'm kind of sad that Sunday school kids never learn the story of Ahud the left-handed man. That's worth looking at. It's actually right before our reading for this week, as we have the story of Ahud the lefty and how he killed King Eglon. But alas, we skip over that. We've actually skipped over a lot since last week in Jericho. We skipped over the entire conquest of the Promised Land, which is, I mean, does kind of get redundant after a while. Children of Israel go to a city, slaughter a bunch of people, take over the city. I think we talked last time about the implications, how this bloodshed here in the Bible can be understood, if not celebrated. We're not happy about other people dying, but again, we get to the book of Judges, and well, here's what's different. Joshua has died long ago, and he has no appointed successor. Unlike when Moses handed off the torch to Joshua, what's happened instead is the tribes have gone their separate ways, which is fine, but there's no concentrated power in Israel. And ideally, that would be okay if everybody did what God gave them the Ten Commandments. Moses gave them really good instructions on how to live in the Promised Land, including the very specific command to teach their children the ways of the Lord. However, that has not happened. Actually, it says right in the book of Judges, a new generation arose which did not know the Lord because their parents didn't teach them. And so we get this cycle in the book of Judges. We're going in a circle to some extent. It's actually a downward spiral would probably be a better way to look at it. So here's what happens. The children of Israel fall into sin. They start essentially imitating the ways of the nations around them, worshiping false gods, and then all the horrible things that false idolatry in those days entailed. They descend into some ugly behavior. And so God says, that's it, I am going to allow a foreign power to oppress you. And it's often a different foreign power. By the time we get to Samson, the Philistines are kind of ascendant in the land. The Midianites during the time of Gideon. The people at the time we begin our story today would be the people of Hazor, no relation to me. They have essentially taken over power in the land of Canaan, and so the Israelites are subject to them. And whenever the Israelites are subject to them, eventually God raises up. After a while, they do come to their senses, and they remember enough of their history that they did have a powerful God at one time who brought them out of Egypt. So they ask him for help, and he always answers their prayers. When they're oppressed, sometimes he lets them stay in oppression for a while to try to learn the lesson, but eventually God raises up what's called a judge. You don't necessarily picture someone wearing a powdered leg and a robe here. These are people who, they're called judges because they do literally judge disputes among the people of Israel. And so consequently, they're given political power. Might be kind of strange. I mean, we don't necessarily picture Supreme Court justices actually running the country. That kind of is what's going on here. These judges do have political and military power, and God raises up a series of judges. Interestingly, as time goes on, the judges get worse. They become more immoral themselves. And we get to Samson, very complicated figure, but in the beginning, the judges are pretty good, pretty solid, God-fearing men and women, as we'll get into today. But so the judges will win a military victory, liberate God's people from whatever oppression they're facing. Things will be going well for a while. the judge will die, and then we start to backslide again. And again, as the cycle keeps repeating itself, apostasy, that's the word for falling away. So apostasy, oppression, judge, delivering, redemption, and freedom, but then apostasy, and then oppression, and then a judge. See the vicious cycle, but again, it gets worse as things go on. But that's the general overlay of the book of Judges. So again, we start today with the people of Israel in oppression, and God raises up a few people here. A judge by the name of Deborah. It is absolutely fascinating here in the ancient world that we do essentially have a woman running the nation of Israel. The prophetess, she's called, so she does have a direct word from God. A prophet is somebody who speaks for God. So Deborah is, she judges disputes, and she also is the one who tells a commander named Barak. She says to him, "Now's the time. God has chosen to deliver us from the oppression of Hazor and the king, a guy named Sisera." And Barak says, "I'm not quite ready to go to war on my own. Will you come with me?" Kind of like a little kid asking his mom, "Will you please come with me?" And Deborah's like, "Oh, sure, I'll go with you. But just so you know, because you're not going on your own, God is going to give the victory to a woman." And Deborah, you assume the woman would be Deborah then, but that's actually, as we see, not the case. So Barak does win a military conquest, which sends Sisera running. And Sisera ends up seeking sanctuary at an ally's house, tent, if you will. There's a tribe of people called the Kenites, and this tribe traces their roots back to Moses' father-in-law, who actually, if we go back further, is a descendant of Abraham. And if you're trying to figure out Abraham's family tree, like, is it Ishmael, Jacob? No, actually, little known fact, it's in the book of Genesis for anyone who wants to see it, but after Abraham's wife Sarah died, he had a whole bunch, he actually took another wife and had a whole bunch of kids, had like 5. He actually had those when those boys grew up. He had them like scatter because it was, we looked at, I guess, in last year's stories, Isaac and Jacob were the line that the Messiah was going to come from, and Abraham wanted that to be clear. But Abraham did have these other descendants, and eventually one of them, there's the tribe that became Moses' father-in-law, and so these Kenites are descendants of Abraham and of Moses' father-in-law, and there's a woman of one of the Kenite leaders named Jael, and she loves her husband, who has a military alliance with Sisera, but she loves God more, and she knows God's word. It's been somehow preserved and passed down to her through her ancestors. And so she is on the side of God's people. And so this Sisera, who is, the conqueror and essentially the king of Canaan at this time, comes to her tent in order to escape from the invading Israelites, or the rebelling Israelites rather, and he expects, because her husband is a good ally, he expects that she's going to take good care of him, give him sanctuary, and she she doesn't seem to do anything to defy those expectations, except for a real subtle thing when he's like, "I'm thirsty, I want some water." And she gives him milk. And does the milk make him tired? I don't know. So he passes out in the tent. He's asleep. And while he's asleep, she gives him a splitting headache. Sorry, bad attempt at humor. Or maybe I'll let you be the judge if that's funny or not. She drives a tent peg through his head. So splitting headache, get it? So she just drove this tent peg She didn't have a weapon handy. She's a woman in the ancient world. She doesn't have the right to bear arms. She's got a tent peg. She drives it through his head. And by the time Barak gets there, here's your enemy. It's all over. The Israelites have a victory. And again, as Deborah prophesied, the ultimate victory is given to this woman here, this woman Jael, who is then later celebrated in song. So we have two chapters. Judges chapter 4 tells the story of the whole, the military situation, and then Judges chapter 5 is just this victory song, which Deborah and Barak sing. I kind of picture like a musical where they take turns. They're gliding across the stage. Deborah sings a few verses in Barak. I don't know if you want to have your kids act that out. Pick a boy and a girl in the class and have them sing. No, maybe not. I'll leave that up to you. But yeah, the song is actually pretty typical. I mean, there's other places. Miriam, the sister of Moses, sings a song. Of course, the Psalms are all songs, many of them about triumphs and victories that God has given to his people. Towards the end of this song, I won't get too much in there. There's some kind of insight into the political situation in this song. Certainly insight into the Lord's hand in things. But towards the end, there's this section here, just in case you were feeling sorry for Sisera. This poor guy who gets his tent pegged through his head. So we have an image of Sisera's mother waiting for him to come home. And he's not coming home because he's dead, because there's a tent peg through his head. She doesn't know this. But she's worried. My son's not coming home. He should be out there conquering those Israelites. And where is he? And some of the neighbor ladies tried to calm her fears. And this is kind of good. They comfort her. Let's see here. Her wisest princess's answer, indeed, she answers herself. So this is what she tells herself to calm down when her son's not coming back from battle. Have they not found and divided the spoil, a womb or two for every man? So here's how she calms herself. Well, he's not taking the opportunity to come home soon because, to put it bluntly, raping a lot of women takes time. That's how she. So don't feel sorry for Sisera here. This, and I mean, this was a common practice in the ancient world. You'd plunder, you'd spoil, and rape and pillage. And so it's actually a fascinating kind of a way that God shows us the value of women to him, even if they're not valued in the ancient world. So how Sisera, I'm looking at chapter 5, verse 30, and the women are devalued by Sisera's mother. She's a woman, right? But a womb or two for every man. These women are reduced to, they're being called wombs. These imagined victims are just simply wombs. But little does she know, a womb has actually driven a tent peg through her son's head. So, yeah, there is justice here. It's a brutal, ugly justice, which much of the book of Judges is. This is where sometimes the Old Testament gets its reputation. There is a lot of blood, violence, and brutality, and yet underneath that, somewhat paradoxically, we do see God's value of human life, and all human life, including like populations that weren't considered valuable, like women, were regarded as mere spoils of war. We see in Deborah and Jael in the story how valuable women are in God's kingdom, how they become ascendant in the story and show that God has a different way of looking at human life and human value than these sinful nations of the world. So, what does this story tell us? Well, I guess we kind of talked about what the story tells us about God and his mercies. Amidst the violence, God has love and value for all people in all populations, all kinds of people. This story shows us that God is willing to fight for his people. He will, when they call out to him and ask for help, when they're being oppressed, even if their oppression is a direct result of their own sin, God will act. God is merciful. He sends people like Deborah. He sends people like Barak. He sends people like Jael. And what does the story tell us about who we are as God's people? Well, Jael is an interesting case here because she has divided loyalties. There's this political situation that her husband has entered into, somewhat on her behalf. There are a lot of advantages to allying with Sisera. He is the most powerful force in the area at this time. But she doesn't hesitate. She knows to who she is. She knows to whom she belongs. And so she chooses to act in a way that probably from an outsider doesn't make much sense. But this is what we do as God's people. We recognize who we belong to, and that means that some of the alliances we would make in this world are not alliances that we will enter into. We will act on behalf of God's kingdom rather than seeming personal self-interest. The story also tells us to have courage as God's people. Deborah was encouraging God's people to have courage, to not be afraid. Barak was a little bit afraid, but in the end, he did have a role to play in the victory, although he wasn't, again, because of his lack of complete courage, he wasn't given the ultimate honor of conquering King Sisera. Judges 5, the Song of Victory. As God's people, we do celebrate his victory, the victories that he allows us to have. All too often, we tend to dwell on the negative and then from one crisis to the other, but to have joy in the victories that God wins. And then where is Jesus in this story? The old Charles Spurgeon, famous American evangelist and preacher from way back, he had an interesting sermon once where he compared Sisera to sin. Yes, King Sisera is like the embodiment of sin. And what do we do with sin? Sin comes to our door and asks for sanctuary. Kind of reminds me of when God says to Cain, sin is crouching at your door. So sin comes right into our house and asks us to asks if it can live with us and take comfort in under our roof. And what do we do with sin? Well, what should we do? According to what Jael does, we should not give sin any quarter. We should instead take a tent peg and drive it through sin's temple. Just this is how we deal with sin in our lives, but also recognizing that we can't, under our own power, have this sin is such a powerful enemy and such a pervasive enemy for us that for us to say every day, like, I am going to drive a tent peg through sin, ultimately we need a Savior who will become sin for us. He who had no sin became sin for us, so that in him we may have the righteousness of God, as Paul writes to the Galatians. And so this is, you have this image here, right? If Jesus didn't have the nails through his head, he had the crown of thorn on his head, but the same kind of action that Jael is taking is an action that the Romans took with Jesus on the cross, as he takes on the embodiment of our sin and the punishment for our sin, so that we may have freedom from the captor, the oppressor of sin. So yes, Sisera was slain, Christ was slain, so that we may have freedom. And in the risen Christ, we do have the freedom to one day inhabit the promised land without the oppressor rearing his head at us. And certainly any kind of conquering action points to what Christ does. So the actions of God through Barak do point ahead to the actions that God would take in our ultimate judge in Jesus Christ. All right, so that's this week's story. Gideon, Samson, we got some more judges to come, and we'll see how the downward spiral continues in the book of Judges anyway. but how in the overall narrative, God is going to bring things back out of that death spiral in His good time and in His gracious way. Blessings on your lessons this week.